This is the true story about how I grew up in a haunted house. I always get a wide variety of reactions from telling this story, but I thought it would be fun to share. The strange thing about the story is that it happened to me, but the story itself is from others, and you'll understand what that means in the end. When I was growing up in Sri Lanka, my family and I moved from a prominently Tamil area in a town called Badaklo to a big city in Colombo. There, we rented a house that, to my memory, was quite lovely. We were 7 people, including my uncle, my brothers, my parents, and my grandma, so we needed a bigger place. This was the cheapest one we found, and yet it was quite nice. It was a big bungalow house. It had a separate guest house that used to serve as the servants' quarters, where the old owner's maid stayed. I thought it had a very pretty design. I was 3 when we moved there, and we stayed there for a couple of years. We were the only people who ever lived there for a couple of years. The first instance of the house started with me. One day, a neighbor that we were very close to came to visit us. He was an older, sweet gentleman who brought us chocolates and candy every time he visited. Apparently, I started acting kind of rude with him, and I started running away when he was around. And when my mom finally asked why I was acting this way, I told her that he was going to die, and I didn't want to be friends with him. 2 days after this conversation, he passed away due to a heart attack. As you can imagine, my mother was freaked out. So she started questioning me about how I knew, and I simply said I did. Unfortunately, this was not an isolated incident. It happened a couple times, and my mom kept this a secret and took care of it the only way she knew at the time. By bringing me to temples. My mother was Hindu, and we did a bunch of pujas to get rid of bad energies, and she asked the priest what could be done about my weird affliction. The answer was that it may just be a gift, and not necessarily something to be worried about. And one of them told my mom some confusing explanation about the date and time that I was born and how it was special according to the religion and how that might lend some insights into the future or the other realm. I never really understood that too much, so I won't try to explain it now. Anyhow, the only people who knew was my mother and then my grandmother. Then soon, the house itself started acting weird. It's quite the cliche haunted house things, really. For example, things would just fall on the ground. There were many nights that there was some loud crash, and it would be the plates that were placed on the rack, or the vegetables that were in a tray now thrown on the floor. We first dismissed them as a stray cat, or maybe we had a mouse problem or something of the sort. Then weirder things started happening. Have you ever heard wet flip-flops walking against the pavement? One night, it was just that sound, all night, all around the house. But when my uncle, who was 18 or 19 at this time, went outside to look, there was no one there. The footsteps are on the ground, but no person. Yet he can hear it, just rounding the corner of the house right in front of him. You might be wondering why we didn't just move. Well, we couldn't. We were from a Tamil-speaking area, and we lived in a predominantly Sinhalese one at this time. We didn't have any relatives nearby that we could stay with. We couldn't rent another house that was closer to the city. It was too expensive. This house was close enough to where we went to school and for my father to go to and from work. I remember we had to take 2 buses to go to my school as it already was. We couldn't move even further. And plus, the person who was actually making the decision, which was my dad, didn't believe any of this. He wasn't there a lot because of his work. He was a policeman, and this was during the Civil War. And actually, he worked night shifts, So he wasn't there at night when the activity was the strongest. And whatever we'd tell him, he'd find some way to explain away. Plus, we kind of learned to live with it, as weird as this sounds. For example, there was this room in the house that for some reason it preferred to be dark. No matter how many times we changed the bulb, it would either explode, which I've seen and which was terrifying, or it would simply burn out and be dark again in a matter of hours. Electricians were useless, and so we just let it stay dark. No one lived in that room. It was like a weird agreement. No one would go in at night, and no one slept there. But unfortunately, as time went by, I apparently started acting even weirder. I started predicting other things, but creepily enough, my favorite thing to predict were deaths. And I also started talking about a friend that I had in the house. My brothers were closer to each other than they were to me, and I didn't speak the language of the neighboring kids at the time. So when I was home, I'd be by myself playing alone. Once, after my uncle taught me how to play checkers, I started spending time playing that game by myself when he would be bored or had to work. He thought I was just being a silly kid, until I started to prefer playing alone than playing with him. Once he observed one of my games, without my knowledge. He said it looked like I was talking to myself. He thought maybe I was singing or talking to an imaginary friend. He saw me move my chip, and after my turn, he saw the piece of the other color move by itself. He kicked off the board and carried me inside, and I think he told my mom. For a couple of days, he kept being close to me, not letting me alone, and he took me to church a lot. He kept insisting my brothers or my mom stayed with me all the time. See, I remember those parts. I remember him staying up late with me and dragging me to church and constantly hounding somebody to watch me. My uncle was starting to convert to Christianity at this point. No one else in the family, just him. He started bringing some church friends over just to pray, and I remember one day even his pastor came. See, I remember those parts, but I don't remember the actual game. That was another thing. I was having these weird blackouts too. Like, I won't remember what I'd been doing when somebody asks me. And the last thing I'd remember happened about an hour ago, or sometimes two. And I'd have no idea what I was doing in the meantime. Granted, I was a kid, and probably I wasn't that busy to start with, but still. Like, once I remember waking up in the guest room one afternoon. The guest house is basically used as a shed to throw random junk we don't use in. I woke up there and I was under a carpet. I was just sleeping on the dusty floor under a rolled up carpet that we never used. I remember waking up and the sun rays hurt my eyes like I've been sleeping for a very long time. It was so hot, and I remember waking up sweating. My babysitter apparently put me to sleep in my mom's room hours ago and thought I was still there. She was watching TV when I walked in and had no idea how I ended up there. My behavior was beyond weird. I was good at school and had friends and hated to be alone. Then I came home and all I wanted to do was to be alone. Eventually, they took me to a child psychiatrist who told them not to treat me like they're afraid of me or for me, which is kind of funny. My poor family had to act like I wasn't a freak. I apparently had a bunch of sessions, and they advised my mom not to make me feel any different. And my mom liked the sessions because she said I was slowly starting to forget. I forgot how I figured out what's going to happen next. I forgot ever having the friends that they described, or speaking to them, or games I played with them. I thought it was ridiculous that it would even be possible. I can't remember anything past a certain point in that house. I can remember what happened with friends and in school and on school trips, but I can't remember anything that happened in the house in the same time frame. My attitude toward the house also started to change. I was getting older, closer to 6, when I remembered starting to feel very afraid of the house, which I wasn't before. There were these hot spots in the house where I was the most afraid. For example, the dark room, the guest house, and the well outside. Anyways, another unforgettable experience in that house was that one night it sounded like rain. When my grandmother went outside to gather the clothes that were drying outside, she realized that it wasn't raining, but yet it sounded like rain over the roof. And then she realized what it was. It was sand. Sand that was on the ground was somehow being thrown onto our roof, and there was so much of it that it sounded like rain. It was basically like we were having a mini tornado, but just in the house, nowhere else, just our house, just our roof. We were perplexed. We all shut the doors and stayed inside. After all of this, luckily, we started doing better financially, and we ended up moving out. And that was the end of our experience in that house. My mom was obsessed with this house, even after we moved out. She seemed to believe that somehow it was connected to my well-being, and she would keep tabs on the house and find out what was happening with it. No one stayed there for long, no longer than few months at most. Whatever was inside the house would torment them until they finally got out. For example, one of the families had a small child who apparently got very sick as soon as they moved in, and no one really knew why. They blamed the house and thought it was bad luck. Now, Sri Lanka tends to be a bit more superstitious than other countries, I admit. Then, of course, the noises at night and the general weirdness of the house drove people away. The last time a tenant saw the house, they actually saw someone there. Now, in all the years that we've lived there, we never saw anyone. People thought that I did, but I don't remember. When the broker and the prospective tenants opened the locked gates to show them the house, they saw a woman kneeling over the well, looking into it, facing away from them. They thought she was homeless, and when they called out to her and asked her to get out, she started screaming. Just one high-pitched, relentless scream. The tenants and the broker were terrified, and they got out of the house and chained the gate and waited outside, and even the neighbors came out to see the commotion. When they went back in some time later, hoping the woman had calmed down, she was gone. The story spread like wildfire, and the house was known as the haunted house on the block. No one else came to rent, and the broker and the owner seemed to have finally given up, and they ended up demolishing the house. This obviously piqued my family's interest, and we asked our mom to call up her old friends from the neighborhood and dig up what happened in the house. One of the few Tamil neighbors in the area was an older uncle who lived there his whole life, just 2 houses away. He gave us the entire story. It was almost a decade before we moved in. The house was built and belonged to a well-off family. They were Tamil too. They were apparently some jewelry store owners. Things were really bad during those times due to the war. Someone apparently lodged a complaint to the authorities that this family was connected to the rebel movement. They were accused of giving them money, namely, for their cause. A lot of people were accused of this at this time, but most had nothing to do with the rebel cause. It was basically a witch hunt. Some people were just accused because they can be accused, because of the language that they speak, and because some people are just terrible human beings. This was when murders and enforced disappearances and hate crimes ran high. Anyhow, one day, a bunch of men wearing uniforms took over the house. The neighbors were terrified of the men and the family who were accused of terrorism. They stayed out of the way. No one in the house was allowed to leave. The family had a male and female servant who stayed in the guest house. Then there was the owner, his wife, and their daughter, and some other person. I think it was the owner's sister. It was 5 or 10 days. I heard two accounts of the events. They were there under a strange house arrest situation. No one could go out and no one could come in, except for their own men. Then one sudden day, the neighbors walked by the house and it was empty. No police, no army, and no family. As far as they knew, they disappeared. There was no funeral, no bodies, and no news. Here's the worst part. No one did anything. No one filed a complaint. No one investigated. The neighbors speculated about what could have happened, that they were maybe murdered or arrested, or maybe they were too embarrassed or traumatized to come back, so they left the house as it was. Either way, some rumor started up about who may have lodged that complaint against them in the first place. The suspect was their own family. There was a sibling the owner of the house had, who after this incident seemed to have taken ownership of the house. His family went overseas after all of this, and they were the ones using the broker to rent out the house. They never lived in it themselves. Yet, most of the details of what happened to the family remains a mystery. When I went back to Sri Lanka, the first time after moving to Canada, I went back to see the neighbors who my mother had remained friends with. After our visit, while my mother was saying goodbye to the family for the 5th time at the gate, I snuck out to see the house that was only like 2 houses away. It looked just like it looked when we lived there. It had these purple flowers that grew across the walls that we never planted, and the house looked exactly the same. I wanted to take a good look at the building, so I was standing on the bar of the gate to look in, when I heard a voice say, "Oh, you're back." I pushed myself off that gate so hard that I landed hard on my tailbone. It wasn't a ghost, though. It was the lady next door. She heard the noise I made trying to climb on the gate, and she looked over, recognized me, and said, "Oh, you're back." But I thought she was a demon or something. But she gave me sweets and tea, and it was okay. I never went there after it was demolished. My mom said it was overgrown with shrubs and grass, and it wasn't being very well maintained. There was some talk about a commercial property being built there, but none of that happened. It's just the land now. It's still there, still empty, maybe still haunted. Either way, thanks for listening, and sweet dreams.